This is an extra video on the ecology topic and for advanced students in biology. So if you're a regular student, this probably will not be on your exam. But remember that we talked about in the last video the idea that matter constantly cycles through the ecosystem, from primary producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers, and ultimately, when they die, it goes to the detritus, which is processed by microorganisms and other detrivores and decomposers and things like that. So the matter will flow, and that detritus that gets processed is then going to be used up, the nutrients, by the primary producers to restart the cycle of matter. So if you follow the blue arrows, you will see that they all end up in the decomposers, and then ultimately from the decomposers it goes to the primary producers again. But if you follow the red arrows, which are the energy transfers, you see that energy comes from the sun, and then once trapped by the sun, by the producers in the organic compounds, it goes along with the matter transfers. So every time you transfer matter, you basically transfer the energy, right? But every step of the way, some of the energy is used up for work and it ultimately dissipated as heat into the environment. And what ends up happening is that the ecosystem is going to need a constant influx of energy, because while the matter is cycling, the energy ultimately gets dissipated into the ecosystem. So you see that the red arrows will never go back to the sun or to the producers. Remember, this has to do with the fact that every energy transfer that takes place, the energy becomes less organized over time. It's the idea of entropy, which means we need a constant influx of energy in ecosystems in order to maintain them. This is even true at the organism level too. And so this can be true for any level of biology that you look at. But definitely an ecosystem is a great way to understand the concept that life requires a constant influx of energy, even if it does recycle the matter that it uses up. So remember then that matter, the energy travels with matter within the ecosystem, but that each step of the way, some of the energy is wasted. So the matter carries less and less energy, which is why the food webs have a limit in size, and because as you go up and up, the efficiency becomes worse and worse, and then you end up not being able to support the higher levels as well as the lower levels. Now, when you look at the amount of energy that's actually coming from an ecosystem, or the amount of energy that's cycling through the ecosystem, there's a concept that's called net ecosystem productivity. Now, this is different from the idea of net primary productivity. Net primary productivity is the total amount of increase in biomass of the producers. So you have the standing crop. Depending on how much that standing crop increases, that's the net primary productivity, or the total amount of new mass added to the producers because of their photosynthetic activity. Likewise, the idea of secondary production has to do with that feed conversion ratio of the consumers, and also the production efficiency of them, because they're also going to use up some of their energy the same way the plants did for their living things. And also remember that the plants do not capture 100% of the energy of the sun as well. So when it's all said and done, efficiency in the ecosystem is going to be limited, and we talked about that already in the previous videos. But if you look at the ecosystem as a whole, all right, just like an organism has a certain amount of energy that it's produced that it doesn't end up being used, the same thing is true of an ecosystem. A lot of the energy that's actually flowing to the ecosystem is extra energy that is never actually used to power life. And this is what we call net primary productivity, the total excess of energy that's available in the ecosystem. Think about it this way. Not every single plant is actually eaten. Not every single bunny is actually eaten. A lot of them end up dying, and then the energy just gets wasted. But the energy is there, available, if needed be. There is a lot of productivity of the ecosystem that's not accounted for. Now, there's two things you can see here. In the water, the redder you see, the more concentration of chlorophyll you have. So the greater the standing crop is going to be. So you can see the areas of the world which are the most productive are the areas in certain coastal areas where there's a lot of nutrients coming off of the continent. Big rivers, things like that. So these nutrients will power up the production in the oceans. Second to that, the great amount of production is going to be in the Arctic zones, especially the North Pole right now, because the South Pole has that whole ozone layer problem. It's killing a lot of the producers. But on the North Pole, you see how there's a lot of production that's going on over there. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of carbon dioxide, because cold water dissolves more carbon dioxide than hot water does. So there's a lot of the nutrients needed for photosynthesis up there. So that allows the algae to bloom, over there. By the way, that's only going to be like that during the summer months. During the winter months, it's going to be the other way around. and you're going to see more green on the bottom of the world than on the top. All right, in terms of productivity, the rest of the oceans are not that productive. And it's actually interesting that you see that the open oceans are blue, and they do have a lot of productivity there, but they don't have as much productivity as the coastal oceans or the polar oceans. Remember, the polar oceans are productive because it has a lot of the nutrients necessary for photosynthesis, including carbon dioxide. And the coastal oceans, for the same reason, you have a lot of carbon dioxide coming from the rivers and other nutrients as well. But other areas of the world are not going to be as productive. Now, also notice that some areas of the world are actually very little productive. The middle of the Pacific Ocean here has a hole in productivity, and you may ask yourself why that's the case. Well, we can talk about that in class. You can come up with ideas. I don't want to give it away right now in this video. But also, I wanted to point out something else. Although the open oceans have less concentration of chlorophyll, they actually make more oxygen than the rest of the world put together, because there's so much algae there. You know, it's such a big space, a big expanse, that it's actually making a lot of oxygen, even though the concentration is very low, because the volume is very big. But the concentration is a lot higher in areas like the polar oceans. And now if you look at the land, the areas with the higher productivity will be indicated with the bluer it can be. So the more green, the better. And you see how the rainforest is going to be one of the areas with the highest amount of productivity around the world. And we'll talk more about in the future lecture series about what exactly is limiting the productivity in each one of these areas. But in terms of the land, water and sunlight are the two major factors there, but especially water. And the cool thing about the rainforest is it's very wet, and that's why it's very productive compared to other ecosystems on Earth. Notice, by the way, how little productivity exists in the desert areas of the world or the Arctic areas of the world. All right, now this idea of net ecosystem productivity means that ecosystems that have a greater amount of productivity can actually support a greater amount of life, a greater amount of diversity. And that is important for biology. That's why we use these satellite images to see the amount of vegetation and the amount of concentration of chlorophyll and things like that. By the way they measure the productivity of the net primary productivity, they can do two things. They can see how much new biomass has been added, so they're measuring the increase in standing crop, basically. Or they can measure the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen coming out of the ecosystems. Because if you have more carbon dioxide being produced than oxygen, that means there's more consumption than productivity. But if you have a lot of oxygen production, that means that there's a lot of productivity, because you have a lot of these producers making photosynthesis. Whichever way you do it, satellite images can measure the amount of increase in vegetation, the change in color of the ocean because of the chlorophyll. And those are ways of assessing the change in the standing crop, to measure the net primary productivity as an indirect measurement of the increase of the productivity of the ecosystem. Or you can also look at the amounts of the gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen, and both those things can be done through satellite. And recent NASA satellites have actually been invested to actually monitor the productivity of the ecosystems around the Earth, because it's important. Because remember, the more productivity you have, the more animals can be maintained and the more biodiversity there exists. And we'll talk later in the lecture series about the importance of biodiversity. And so this is something that scientists are very interested in. By the way, in this picture, you see how much us as humans are actually using of that productivity. This is the amount of consumption by humans around the world. So this is the amount of energy that humans are actually consuming. So you see the areas in redder are the areas that are producing the most amount of carbon dioxide. So this is the opposite of the ecosystem productivity graph that we saw in the other picture. This is the human consumption graph, and you can see how we're affecting the world. And look at the developing areas in Asia and how much consumption there is over there. Also a large concentration on Europe as well as the east coast of the United States. So you can see how or impact in the world. This is a good graph to see or impact in the world, or carbon footprint, basically how much carbon dioxide we're producing, either by burning fossil fuels or by basically doing cellular respiration. By the way, when you burn fossil fuels, you're basically burning material that was produced a long time ago, so it's the same difference. All right, it's just that it got fossilized, but it's a fossil fuel, but it's still productivity from a very long time ago that's now being released into the ecosystem.